All right, good. All right, I think we're good. All right, so last week we talked about how God reveals himself. So this week we're going to talk about how we receive that, right? And then after that, for the rest of the semester, we'll talk about what it is we actually receive, okay? The picture is St. Peter of Verona. Who knows the story of St. Peter of Verona? Anyone know it? So up at St. Catherine's, there's a statue of him, and everyone is like fascinated by the statue because it's a hatchet in his head, right? And so he was a 12th century saint who had a habit of really annoying heretics, especially the Manichaeans. He was really he was a stickler for the creed. And so they were lying in wait for him one time in an alley. He walked by, and the dude took an axe and put it right in his head, right in the middle of his head. And St. Peter of Verona is unfazed by this. Literally, and he starts walking down the street, just like there's nothing in his head, right? And then he notices the blood, and so then he gets down on his knees and he starts writing the creed in blood on the ground. And then the guys catch up to him again and stab him. Okay. So he doesn't just say, and this is really important. This is the whole point of what we're going to talk about today. He doesn't just say, "I believe," right? He just doesn't write out Credo. He writes out the whole creed. So what he believed mattered, okay? And that's the whole point of why we're doing this, like bigger picture. But like the world would say right now, it doesn't matter what you believe, right? And the church would say it absolutely does, right? And I mean, there's martyr after martyr after martyr after martyr that said, yeah, what we believe matters, right? Because he could have just said, no, the Manichaeans, they worship the same God. It's okay, or whatever, right? But he didn't whatever it. Instead, he's like, okay, this matters. Like the truth of what God reveals matters. And it's a saving truth, but the content of it matters. So you can't just say, I believe. You have to say, what you believe, right? It's like sitting down in a restaurant and just, the waitress walks up and just go, I order. Like, what do you mean you order? What do you order? Right? It has to have an object, right? And so the object that it points to is always what God has revealed. Right? So that part is really important. All right, it would be really nice if everything worked the way I planned it to, but of course not. Okay. All right, so here's where I want to start. And if you guys online want to unmute while we're talking about this, first of all, how many times have you heard this saying, I'm spiritual but not religious? A lot, right? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with being spiritual but not religious? Yeah, CB.
Like first, like what do they mean by those terms? Like not trying to get like too philosophical, but what specifically do you mean? How can you be spiritual but not religious? Like what are you trying to differentiate?
Yeah. Does anyone know of a person that's spiritual but not religious? I mean, I know of like the anti, like Satan is spiritual but not religious, right? I mean, he's absolutely not religious. So it has that feel to it, but what they're really saying is, I don't like creeds, right? I don't like dogma. I don't like. It's just I don't like organized religion, right? And the problem with that, of course, is that the religion, I mean, properly speaking, is Michael and I were talking about this the other day, right? Religion is really what we owe to God, right? So it's a virtue, and it's what we owe to God, right? And so God reveals certain things to us about himself, and that's a response. We have to have a certain response because of that, right? Like you go before the Blessed Sacrament, and there's a response to that, right? Like you're like, God is really there, like, and you fall to your knees. So our sort of religion matters, right? And the creed matters because if we don't have a creed, we end up having chaos, right? And people just kind of go where they feel comfortable, where they get sort of fed. It's usually just feeding themselves, right? But that's like if you read the Old Testament, what is like? How many of you try to go through the book of like Leviticus? Really hard, right? Like that's the usually the place where people go, I'm going to read the Bible in a year, and they get through like the first 2 books, and they hit Leviticus, and they're like, I'm not reading the Bible in a year, right? Because there's all these little things God's like, you worship like this is like very specific, right? Very specific about how that's because what we do in our body matters, the way we respond to things matters. And he's very meticulous about how we're supposed to worship him because it's for our own good, right? It's not that God needs us to worship him, right? Yeah, CD.
There was years ago, there was a really popular like spoken word video that's like, I like Jesus, but not religion. And it tried to basically like say why the structure in religion, why having structure in religion loses sight of Jesus in a very weird way.
Yeah, in a very weird way, right?
Can you move those to the side?
Yeah, I probably can. Maybe. All right, so Dorothy Sayers, who was Anglican, not a Catholic, but she wrote an essay in the 40s talking about the necessity for a creed. She said, if you do not have a creed, you have chaos. Christian doctrine is not a set of rules, but one vast interlocking rational structure, right? And if you think about that, everything this is why we have to be so careful about what we believe, because everything's interconnected, right? So God reveals something and everything connects to it. And if you pull one thing out, right, you begin to, you think about like even historically, right? Like when in the 4th century, when there were heretics saying that, oh no, Mary's not the mother of God, she's just the mother of Jesus, right? It's just a simple thing, simple changing of the words. And then everything would tumble away if they don't correct it, right? And this is what we talked about last week, about the necessity to protect what we've been given, because if one thing is pulled away, if you pull it at that seamless garment, the whole thing comes apart, right? All right, so here's what the Catechism says. The Greek word symbolon meant half of a broken object. For example, a seal presented as a token of recognition. The broken parts were placed together to verify the bearer's identity. The symbol of faith, then, is a sign of recognition and communion between believers. Symbolon also means a gathering, collection, or summary. The symbol of faith is a summary of the principal truths of the faith, and therefore serves as the first and fundamental point of reference for catechesis. Right, so you'll often hear I think one of the Catholic press, their catechism sort of stuff is called symbolon, and that's where they get it, where it's this bringing together of all of the sort of articles of the faith. So John Henry Newman wrote a sort of like an autobiographical fiction work called Loss and Gain. And in that book, what he does, he sort of tells his conversion story. And one of the things he talks about is that he was Anglican at the time. And so he would go to 5 Anglican priests, ask them a question, and get 5 different answers. And he'd go to 5 Catholic priests, and they'd give all the same answers. What they believed was now this probably wouldn't happen today. But theoretically, hopefully if he went to 5 of you, he'd get all 5 the same answers. And what he found was, he's like, that's really compelling. Like, that's really compelling that there's something like tangible and something that they actually all believe. And so that part about sort of the symbolon of keeping it all together, of this seal coming together, is really important, because the opposite of symbolon is diabolon, which is where we get the word diabolic, right? So diabolic or diabolon, it means to pull it apart, tear it apart, tear it asunder. So that's why Our Lady is the crusher of heresies, is because as soon as there's a heretic, you just stick Our Lady on them, right? And that's why the devil tries to just pull apart the creed, right? Piece by piece by piece. And that's why the church has had to protect it over all this time. All right, so today we're going to talk about, so the idea of having a creed, really important. What we're going to talk about is faith, okay? And we're going to sort of juxtapose natural faith with spiritual faith, all right? So let's come up with good definition first. So in order to sort of understand supernatural faith, which is a little bit of a mystery, mystery in the sense of not that we can't necessarily grasp it, but that really sort of deep and we won't fully grasp it. So faith, according to St. Thomas, is the assent to those things which are unseen, all right? Again, we're sort of trying to build on our natural understanding of faith, make some distinctions, and then we'll get to where we have supernatural faith. All right. What's the distinction, first of all, between natural faith and supernatural faith, besides the word super? Like when I say that, does that resonate at all? You're like, okay, I know what he means. All right, so when I say that, what I mean is natural faith is just simply believing something that somebody tells you, sort of sight unseen. Okay. Supernatural faith is the gift that God gives you. He gives you, right? That you believe what God says, sight unseen. Okay. And when you take something on faith, natural, or at least in a natural realm, there's some sort of relationship with the person telling you, right? Whether you think maybe they're an expert in the field or you know them really well, or something like that, right? So that's the first part, and I want to build on this a little bit because the trust element is really important, especially when we're trying to evangelize. Right? So here's what John Paul II says in his encyclical Fides et Ratio. It says, we entrust ourselves to the knowledge acquired by other people. Right? So we give ourselves over to knowledge that somebody else has. Okay. When you take your car to the mechanic, right, you entrust yourself over to his knowledge. This suggests an important tension. On the one hand, the knowledge acquired through belief can seem an imperfect form of knowledge. So he's sort of saying, okay, well, it seems like if you don't experience something firsthand, it's not good enough, right? It's an imperfect form of knowledge to be perfected gradually through personal accumulation of evidence. On the other hand, belief is often clearly richer than mere evidence because it involves an interpersonal relationship that brings into play not only a person's capacity to know, but also the deeper capacity to entrust oneself to others, to enter into a relationship with them, which is intimate and enduring. Right? So the point is that there's always this element that the witness is credible, right? There's always this element, this interpersonal element is what he's sort of getting at, and this is John Paul II's personalism, where he says, okay, if you really trust someone, like you're gonna pretty much do whatever they say, right? Like you're gonna go, okay, I don't really know that this is true, but I know that I can trust you, right? Like great example of at the end of John 6, all Jesus' disciples leave, and Peter and the 12 they stay behind. What do they say? He's like, are you gonna leave too? And they say, no. They don't say no because everything you just said makes sense to us. In fact, they say the exact opposite. They're like, I have no idea what you just said, but we know you have the words of eternal life, right? So like, Jesus, I trust you. No idea whether, what this all means, but I'm going to trust you, right? And I do trust you, right? And so this, again, in our own sort of efforts to evangelize, is really important, right? Where what we want to do is develop trust, like where people trust us so that we can hand them over to Jesus, right? Where they go, well, Michael would never steer me wrong, right? So this Jesus guy must be trustworthy because he says he is. Okay, that's really important, and that's why, like, especially now, with everybody being so isolated, like flyby evangelization doesn't work, right? Evangelization on Facebook doesn't work. Not that you just abandon it altogether, but it sort of doesn't count, right? Like you've got to get into a relationship with someone where they go, yeah, like discipling is really important, okay, and this is why. Right? So this idea of opening up, and then once someone, like, it's amazing how once you get to the point where that trust is developed, right, where suddenly even the church's hard teachings, you're like, it's fine, Jesus said it, I'll do it. He's got my best interest at heart, right? And even the hardest of the teachings, right, which is just repeating what Peter did, all right? All right, so that trust, really important, right? So we should have reasons to trust, but we don't just necessarily, it doesn't have to be blind, right? There can be reasons to assent to what they're proposing. All right, so now we're going to start building up from this idea of sort of assent to something that we don't see towards the supernatural definition of faith. And so we'll start with what the Bible calls faith. So faith, the letter of the Hebrews chapter 11 says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Right? So what does this mean? So substance is really more of like a Greek philosophical term. It's just this thing that subsists, or it's like has its own substance, its own thing. It exists outside of the person, right? And we'll talk about why that's important, right? The substance of things hoped for. What are the things that are hoped for? What are the things we hope for? Eternal life, right? Like that's the thing hoped for. So what it's saying is that actually faith is the same thing as eternal life, right? So what is eternal life? Like, what is that? What are we going to be doing in heaven? Seeing God, right? Seeing God without anything in the way. Seeing God as he really is. So knowing, like, seeing is an intellectual thing, right? So we'll know him as he is known. Like, we'll know him, right? So what is faith? It's just one sort of step back from that, right? It's just the veil in the way, but it's the same thing, right? So God, what he does is infuses knowledge of himself into us, right? And as we keep getting closer and closer to it, right, faith grows, right? So when it says the substance of things hoped for, it is the seeds of eternal life. It's the same thing that will just grow and expand, right? Like, so we have faith in the Trinity, right? When we see God face to face, it won't require faith anymore, right? Because we'll have vision. We'll be able to see it clearly without that veil in the way. Okay. So that part is really important to understand that even now, this is like the beginnings of heaven. And so again, why does it matter what we believe about God, right? Because those things that we actually hope for and are real and tangible and not something just sort of subjectively we figure out on our own. Okay. And so faith is this sort of, it's an act, but it's also a habit, right? So it's a virtue, which we'll talk about in just a second, to see things the way God sees things, right? And think about that for a second, right? As your faith grows, what happens? You begin to see the world the way God intended the world to be. Not necessarily like, okay, all suffering goes away, not like that, but you begin to see what God is doing in the world, right? As faith increases. All right, so here's Pope Benedict in his encyclical on hope, Spe Salve. Here's what he says, his interpretation of that verse from Hebrews. He says, faith is a habitus, that is a stable disposition of the spirit through which eternal life takes root in us. This is basically saying what we just said. And reason is led to consent to what it does not see. The concept of substance is therefore modified in the sense that through faith, in a tentative way, or as we might say, in embryo, and thus according to the substance, there are already present in us the things that are hoped for, the whole true life, right? Heaven is already growing inside of us, is what he's saying, that vision of God. This is really important. For those of you that haven't come before, so normally what I do, I'll have these quotes from a pope or whatever to verify what I said, but also to begin to put it in sort of layman's terms so that you can go back and read these things and understand them. Okay. And precisely because the thing itself is already present, this presence of what is to come also creates certainty. This thing, which must come, is not yet visible in the external world. It does not appear, but because of the fact that as an initial and dynamic reality, we carry it within us, a certain perception of it has even now come into existence. All right, so the fact that he uses what he's getting at is a really important fact because it separates Catholics from Protestants. And what he's saying is that the use of the word substance, right, it means it's a thing, right? It actually exists, objectively exists, right? So but what do Protestants say about faith? It's completely subjective, right? So it's just this sort of interior attitude, right? Whereas what Pope Benedict is saying and what the church teaches is that it's actually something objectively given to us by God that continues to expand, right? It is something we can lose because it's an objective thing. It's ours, but it's not ours, right? It continues to grow in us, but not according to just our subjective attitude, the way Protestants would. In fact, if you were to keep reading this paragraph later on, he's pretty harsh with sort of what Martin Luther believes, and it's because, again, Luther just sees it as something subjective rather than something coming from God. Okay. All right, so let's go a little deeper now. Let's see if we can come up with a definition of supernatural faith. Again, John Henry Newman, as this, he says, faith is assenting to a doctrine as true, which we do not see, which we cannot prove, because God says it's true, who cannot lie. Right? And so faith isn't scientific demonstration, right? So at least we can't necessarily, again, we've talked about this before, you can't prove the Trinity, right? You can't, no matter where you start, you can't get to the Trinity, okay? You can certainly make, use human reason to understand it a little better and all of that, but you can't get to it, okay, is what he's saying. So he's saying that we assent to it because God said it, right? So again, it's this credible witness, the witness in God, right? So faith rests upon the fact that God has spoken. And we'll see why that notion then is really important, that God has spoken. But it's ultimately a trust in God and saying, God, you can't lie, so you said it, so I believe. Okay. All right, we're going to move towards that a little deeper now. Okay. Here's what the First Vatican Council said. Faith is a supernatural virtue by means of which, with the grace of God, inspiring and assisting us, we believe to be true what he has revealed, not because we perceive its intrinsic truth by the natural light of reason, but because of the authority of God himself, who makes the revelation and can neither deceive nor be deceived. Okay, so that's more expanding on what John Henry Newman says. But what I want to get at here is, what is a virtue? What is a virtue? How is faith a virtue? Go ahead, Steve.
It's an action.
Okay, so it has action to it.
There's a grow in it.
Yeah, so certainly you can grow in it.
It should become habitual.
So it's definitely habitual, right? And what do we mean by habitual? When we say it's habitual, it's important for us to sort of grasp what a virtue is, right?
Like the more we do it, the more we want to do it.
Yeah, so it's a disposition, like a firm, the definition is a firm and habitual disposition to the good. It's just the general, right? So in this case, so think of it like a muscle, right? What happens with a muscle the more you exercise it? It gets stronger, right? And is it painful at first to exercise a muscle? Yeah, right? Because the muscle's out of shape. So same thing in sort of the spiritual life, right? Where virtues are hard at first because we're starting from sort of ground zero of being fallen creatures, right? But after a while, the muscle gets stronger, there's less pain in doing it. We increase the resistance against which the muscle works. And then you get to a certain point where even though it's hard, it's pleasurable, right? Because you're using the muscle for what it was made for, right? And so a virtue, say the virtue of courage, right? At first, to do even the smallest courageous act is really hard, right? And then you do it more, and each time it's not just a matter of just exercising at the same level, right? Like your courage has to be tested so that it can grow, okay? And as it grows, then it gets stronger. And then as it gets stronger, it gets easier to a certain extent in that no longer are you like dreading it, right? No longer are you, when someone's run into a burning building once, the next time they run into a burning building to save someone, it's a little bit easier, right? Like, I've done this before, right? All right, so faith then as a virtue, it points to God, right? And at first, when God puts faith into us, for the most part, it's weak, right? It has to be exercised. It has to be tested in order to be exercised, right? So remember, it's a firm and habitual disposition to the good. So only when faith is tested can it be strengthened. Okay. If everything's just sort of status quo, then the faith just sort of stays the same, right? And so what does God do? Well, a lot of times along the spiritual journey, right, he withdraws from us, right? Because now there's a little bit of, in order to, have you ever Have you ever like gone into a movie theater and come out and just been the light just you're like, wow, that's really bright. You almost can't see, right? Well, that's what's happening to us, right? Where all of a sudden God is flooding light at us, and our eyes can't, our mind can't grasp it, right? And everything just seems really dark at first, right? But then eventually your eyes adjust and you're able to see, right? And so God tests our faith, usually by seemingly to withdraw from us, but he's leading us, okay? Leading us. All right, so that part is really important. The other part that's important as well is the difference between faith and opinion. Right? So something like cafeteria Catholicism, right, where we pick and choose. Is that faith? No, that's just opinion, right? That is, oh, I happen to agree on this. There's no faith there, right? Faith is believing what God says because he said it, not because I agree. Okay? And so that's why, heresy or those are sins against faith and cause us to lose our faith, right? And so something like what we call sort of cafeteria Catholicism, which is really just wherever the church agrees with me, it's right. Rather than Jesus said it, I don't really like it, but I believe it's true, which that's faith. Okay, so we have to make that distinction between, because ultimately what faith is turning yourself over to the person, right? So I've given myself completely to God, right? I'm like, okay, this teaching on contraception, like this makes no sense to me, but Jesus said it through the church, so here I am giving myself over to it, okay? So remember John Paul II's definition, like it's an entrusting, right? It's taking your intellect and giving it to God. I will see the world the way you have made the world and the way you want me to see it. And that takes a tremendous amount of humility, right? And trust. Right? And that's why humility ultimately is the sort of the linchpin of the spiritual life, right? All right, so I said earlier that it was really important for us to have reasons to believe, okay? Not necessarily, or I said that it was really important for us to grasp the fact that if God speaks, I'm going to do what he says. So, but all that hinges on how do we know God spoke it, right? Because all over the place, there's people saying like, oh, God said this, God said that. God doesn't care if you do this, God doesn't care if you do that. So the church has sort of enumerated what are called the motives of credibility. So what makes the Catholic Church the place where God is speaking? Right? What are the things that a reasonable person would go, yeah, you know what? I think it's right? And so again, they don't go and purchase faith that way. What they do is they remove the obstacles, right, for the invasion of grace to come in. So they look at these reasons and they say, yeah, you know what? It's a little odd that the Catholic Church has been around for so long. And they open up and they're like, huh. And so these sort of motives of credibility pave the way. And it's very much like Newman's experience, right? Where he suddenly he's like, well, that's really odd. All my life I thought that the Catholic Church was not the true church and the Anglican Church was, and suddenly, they actually appear to have a better grasp on the truth, right? And what happens? Well, grace has now opened up, right? Because we can't earn grace, right? But we can remove all the obstacles out of the way, and that's what we're trying to do. All right, and that's this idea. All right, so St. Thomas Aquinas, he says, okay, there's these motives of credibility. There's a twofold mode of truth in what we profess about God, right? So he's starting with okay, is it reasonable first and foremost to believe in God? Like that would be the place that it starts, right? Then, is there enough of traces around him that I can naturally say God exists? There's a twofold mode of truth in what we profess about God. Some truths about God exceed all the ability of the human reason. Such is the truth that God is triune. But there are some truths which the natural reason also is able to reach. Such are that God exists, that he is one, and the like. In fact, such truths about God have been proved demonstratively by the philosophers guided by the light of natural reason. All right. So what I want to do then for the rest of the time is first we're going to look at some just sort of simple proofs for God's existence. and then we'll talk about the motives of credibility. All right, so it is, I guess, ironic above all that the church teaches as a matter of faith that you can prove the existence of God by reason. Right? And so here's what the First Vatican Council said. If anyone says that the one true God, our Creator and Lord, cannot be known with certainty from the things that have been made by the natural light of human reason, let him be anathema. Right? And all that's simply just saying is that you can look at the world and look at through the lens of experience and through philosophy and prove that God exists. Right? Remember, we can't get any further than that using human reason, but it removes the obstacles of going, I don't believe in God at all. Okay. So we can know. So you guys understand like the difference between belief and knowledge, right? It's not that belief is any less sort of secure, but belief rests upon somebody else's sort of knowledge, right? Whereas knowledge, if we say knowledge, we mean sort of first-hand knowledge. All right, so Richard Dawkins, I'm sure a lot of you know who he is. He is sort of this leader of the new atheists, and he's written a lot of books against Christianity. And unfortunately, I think he's an evolutionary biologist that he likes to pretend that he's a philosopher, and he's a horrible philosopher. But he decided in one of his books called The God Delusion that he was going to take on Thomas Aquinas. And unfortunately for him, I guess he lost. But what I want to do is sort of look at his argument and then see if we can come up with a response to it. Okay. All right, so here's what he says, okay? He says all three of these arguments, he's talking about the first three of, St. Thomas has five, what he calls 5 ways to prove God's existence. He says all three of these arguments rely upon the idea of a regress and invoke God to terminate, all right? So this idea of infinite regress, everyone understand what that means, right? Where, like if A happened, if A happened and B had to start it, but B didn't start itself, C has to come along and so forth, okay? And he says, okay, unless, he thinks what the argument is unless, there's this thing that doesn't need to be started, it can start itself, then you have this infinite regress and the whole chain never starts, all right? So think of it as like the locomotive where you keep going, car by car by car, and you never get to the engine, so the cars never can move without an engine, okay? So the engine can move itself, all right? That's sort of his way of looking at it, right? And this is actually the reason why I'm doing this is because a lot of Christians sort of think this is what his argument is, what Thomas's argument is, okay? They make the entirely unwarranted assumption that God himself is immune to regress. Even if we allow the dubious luxury of arbitrarily conjuring up a terminator to an infinite regress and giving it a name simply because we need one, there's absolutely no reason to endow that terminator with any of the properties normally ascribed to God: omnipotence, omniscience, goodness, creativity, and design. Okay. We'll sort of put the last part aside for right now and not get bogged down in the details. But what I want to do is talk about this idea of the first mover. Okay, how many of you guys have heard that sort of argument for the first mover? All right. So the whole key to this thing is understanding when St. Thomas talks about a first mover, he doesn't mean a first mover in time. All right. So he doesn't mean that there has to be, if we keep going back in time to the Big Bang, for example, there has to be a Big Bang. All right. That isn't what he means. So it doesn't mean like for me to be here, there have to be, my parents had to exist and my grandparents had to exist and all of those things, right? St. Thomas says that, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, right? You could have an infinite creation, and a creation is co-eternal with God, all right? But what St. Thomas does say, and what Dawkins is missing, is when St. Thomas says this sort of idea of one thing hinging on another, he means right here, right now, all right? So there's nothing in the world that exists on its own, right? Everything owes its existence to something else, right? There's no self-existing thing, all right? So we can go 2 directions with this. We could go back in time or we could go right now. If there's no self-existing thing, then I have to be held in existence by something currently, all right? So let's just say it's me standing in this room, all right? I'm held in existence standing on top of the floor, which is held in existence underneath it, underneath. Like you keep going down, right? And all of those things depend on their existence for something else, because there was a time when they didn't exist. All right. And if there's a time they didn't exist, then they're not self-existing. Right. So for all of those things to exist right here, right now, there has to be a creature or there has to be a being which has its own existence, is the cause of its own existence here and now. All right. And we say that being is God. Right. And that's all St. Thomas says in the first three, just different variations of that. The key is not to go backwards in time, but to go up and down here and now. Okay. Right. Does that make sense?
Are you saying it is dependent or not dependent?
What well, I'm dependent right here, right now, for my existence, ultimately on God,
Yes.
who is self-existent. He doesn't have dependence. Because if that being didn't self-exist, then nothing right now would exist. It's like the idea with the train, right? So there can't be, for here and now existence, there can't be an infinite regress. Because nothing would exist here and now. All right? Yes?
So is the Catholic Church teaching that creation is eternal with God?
Well, he just says you can't necessarily, you can't prove that creation is not eternal. He says it's revealed as a matter of faith, but using reason, you could like if the Big Bang was true, for example, and you went back to the Big Bang, you could say, okay, before that, everything just went into it, and it's been expanding, coming back. There's no, of course, like scientifically now they found that that's probably the case, but he just says you can't prove using human reason that the world is not eternal. That creation is not eternal. That has to be revealed.
How would, if you have to explain to someone that A created B, but they existed at the same time, what would be a good way to explain it?
What do you mean by? So give me an example of like A exists. So you mean as far as like, so St. Thomas uses this example. Maybe this will help. He uses the example of a stick moving. So there's a rock on the ground, right? The rock doesn't move on its own. It only moves as the stick pokes it, right? And the stick only moves if the hand moves it. And then he gets to God and he says, well, that the hand only moves if you will, if this sort of immaterial person like wills it, right? And the only reason why I can will is because I'm being held in existence right now by God. So that, again, if the whole key is that it's right here, right now. Okay. I think that question's been there a while, so I'll come back to that. All right, so that's the sort of summary, all right? And there's a Dominican from the early 20th century, Father Reginald Garrigou Lagrange. I'll just give you the quote real quick, that if you're interested, you can go a little deeper to see. He says all these arguments can be summed up in a more general one, based on the principle of causality, which is to be stated as follows. That which does not exist by itself can exist only by another, which is self-existent. Now experience shows that there are beings endowed with activity, life, and intelligence, which do not exist of and by themselves, since they are born and die. Therefore, they receive their existence from another, who must be existence, life, and intelligence itself. If such were not the case, we should have to say that greater comes from the less, a higher form of life from the lower, and the plurality of beings come from a primary being less perfect than all the others taken together. I won't sort of unpack what he's saying, but I give you his name because he was actually John Paul II's spiritual director, and probably like the greatest commentator on St. Thomas from the 20th century. All right, let's get into the motives of credibility. All right, and then we'll finish with these. All right, so from the Catechism, what moves us to believe is not the fact that revealed truths appear as true and intelligible. Sort of covered that. In the light of our natural reason, we believe because the authority of God himself who reveals them, who can neither deceive nor be deceived. So that the submission of our faith might nevertheless be in accordance with reason, God willed that external proofs of his revelation should be joined to the internal helps of the Holy Spirit. Thus, the miracles of Christ and the saints, prophecies, the church's growth in holiness and her fruitfulness and stability are the most certain signs of divine revelation, adapted to the intelligence of all. They are motives of credibility, which show that the assent of faith is by no means a blind impulse of the mind. Okay, so what this is sort of getting at is why faith is reasonable. Okay. So, and it goes back to what I said earlier about, if we're going to believe what God says, and we're going to trust God, well, how do we know it's him speaking, right? And these are the ways we know. And so the first part that the Catechism gives is miracles. And St. Thomas, in his Summa Contra Gentiles, also goes through this, all right? So here's what he says. Those who place their faith in this truth, however, for which the human reasons offer no experimental evidence, do not believe foolishly, as though following artificial fables. For these secrets of divine wisdom, the divine wisdom itself, which knows all things to the full, has delighted to reveal to men. It reveals its own presence as well as the truth of its teachings and inspiration by fitting arguments. And in order to confirm those truths that exceed natural knowledge, it gives visible manifestation to the works that surpass the ability of all nature. Thus, there are wonderful cures of illnesses, the raising of the dead, and wonderful immutation in the heavenly bodies. What is more wonderful, there is inspiration given to the human mind so that simple and untutored persons, filled with the gifts of the Holy Spirit, come to possess instantaneously the highest wisdom and the readiest eloquence. All right, so what's he getting at? Why do we believe Jesus is who he says he is? Oh, what reason would we think, well, that's reasonable? Why is it reasonable to believe that Jesus is who he says he is? We can even jump in our little time machine and go back to the first century. Why would you believe Jesus is who he says he is?
Because of his death and resurrection.
Because his resurrection, right? I mean, ultimately, like that is the sort of ultimate sort of stamp on, who he says he is, right? So if you read like John's gospel, right, what does John call his miracles? He calls them signs, right? He doesn't really talk about miracles. He said, in fact, he kind of glosses over the miracles, right? So he sort of says, oh, Jesus does this. And then he talks about what it actually means, right? So for God, miracles, they're not just sort of this trick or something, right? What they're really getting at is it's his stamp of approval on what's being done or said. Okay? That the person is authentically connected to God, right? And in fact, it's one of the arguments further in this one later that St. Thomas uses for why Islam is false. He says, that Muhammad performed no miracles. Right? If he had God's stamp of approval, he could have performed miracles. All right. So this power of the miracle, right? So John uses this to sort of talk about the signs, right? And so why do we believe the apostles? Yeah, well, one, because they saw their friend die and they became totally fearless of death, right? And remember, we talked last week about us being credible witnesses, but that's what Jesus did. He's like, okay, from all eternity, who am I going to pick to be my credible witnesses, right? He didn't just appear to everybody. He appeared to the apostles, and then, ultimately St. Paul says he appeared to 500 other people because they were all handpicked from all eternity to be his credible witnesses, right? And so how were they credible witnesses? They were willing to die, right? Like they're ultimately willing to die, right? And again, like martyrdom, like don't forget what the word martyrdom means. It means witness, right? So you're witnessing to the fact that what you have professed by your life is true. And how do we know that? How do we know that a martyr? Because crazy things happen when they die, right? Like St. Lawrence. You guys all know the story of St. Lawrence? He's being roasted on a stake. I mean, and he just looks at the guy. He's like, okay, I think that side's done. Just turn me over. Like, can you imagine, like, you're an executioner and you're doing this, and you're like, why is he not screaming in pain? Everyone we've ever done this to is screaming in pain. Because what is he doing ultimately? He's witnessing to the faith. He's witnessing to the truth of faith. The only thing the person can go is, okay, that what they're saying, that God they're talking about, has to be the real God. Right? So martyrs, that's why they're witnesses. Okay, is because God stands behind them, right? That's why they die in these unbelievably amazing and miraculous ways. Right? Our Lady of Guadalupe, another example, right? Like, here come these Catholics from Spain, really not living the Catholic life real high, not treating the people real well, and all of a sudden, this lady appears, right? And she appears to one of their own, and all of a sudden, 9 million conversions in 10 years. I mean, that's miraculous, right? How about Our Lady of Fatima, another one, right? These little children are like, yeah, she's appearing to us, and they're like, shut up. Like, you guys are imagining things, their parents are telling them to imagine things. Nope, here's what she said. You get, and ultimately we hear everything that she told them, right? And they say, oh, and by the way, there's going to be this miraculous sign on the last day when she comes on October 13th. And what happens? 70,000 people see the sun come at them. God saying, there you go. What their message is true, all right? So we can't discount miracles at all, right? And that's the purpose, right? That's why, you don't just have miracles on demand. Yes, Michael.
I'm not sure if this is in like the Antichrist, can the Antichrist work miracles?
So, I mean, you have well, he's going to mislead a lot of people. So think in terms of like Pharaoh's, since we sort of know the story a little bit better. Pharaoh's, so Moses has all these things, these signs, right? And like like his staff turning into a serpent, he's like, my magicians can do that, right? And yet when he does that, like when they do that, like Moses' serpent eats their serpent, right? So there's just this idea of you have to be careful, right? That what's being said is genuine, because demons have powers over nature too, and that's why you have to sort of check it. That's why when you hear things about like Our Lady's appearances, you go look at the church first. What does the church say about this, right? Because ultimately she has to put her stamp of approval on it first, because we could be deceived. Yes.
How would you respond to someone who says, I mean, I have not seen all these miracles. I will believe in God if some miracle happens to me.
Yeah, I would say that they're asking for too much, right? Because the point is, like, you don't need a miracle to believe in God, right? Right. The miracle is not for like personal belief; it's to put the stamp on the person that what they're saying is coming from God. I think that's probably what I would say. Like that's what miracles are for. Because you've had 100 people come to you and tell you about God, but you didn't believe them. It's almost like Christ with the story about Lazarus and the rich man, right? He's like it doesn't matter. Like even if people rise from the dead, they won't believe it, right? All right. So what's the next motive of credibility? The next motive of credibility is the mass conversions. Again, something that these questions have to be answered, right? Like for someone to actually object with the church. When these arguments were examined through the efficacy of the above mentioned proof and not the violent assault of arms or the promise of pleasure, right? So he's talking about first how the church spread and how it and how conversions happen. Right? So he's saying, okay, for example, the early church, right? The early church grew at about 40% per decade for the first 300 years. Think about that for a second. Like the church from being 40% larger every 10 years, for 300 years. Oh, by the way, while everyone's life was on the line if they admitted to it. How does that happen? Right? How does that? And it didn't matter who it was. It wasn't just poor ignorant Slavs from the backwater Roman towns. It was across the board, right? And not only is it just this sort of assent to Jesus, that he was actually the Son of God, but yeah, all that stuff and pleasure that the world says is good, like it says don't do that, and people don't do it. So these fallen, broken people are suddenly acting totally differently on their own volition, right? So he says the pleasures of the flesh should be curbed, and the things of the world should be spurned, right? Like tell a whole bunch of people that, and what are most people's responses, just on a natural level? Like, dude, you're nuts. What are you thinking? And yet, that was the message. It remains the message, but that was the message in its growth. continued growth over time of people going, yeah, I want to live the ascetic life. I want to live like that. And so the mass conversion, you have to answer the question as to why the church grew the way it did and why it's still, because on a natural level, it doesn't make any sense, right? Like saints make zero sense on a natural level. And so you've got to explain it, okay? All right, second to last one, I think. They're into the church. Why the church has, this is actually the last one. Why the church, he says that the last sort of motive of credibility is why the church lasted or has lasted as long as it has. So this wonderful conversion of the world to the Christian faith is the clearest witness of the signs given in the past. So it's not necessary that they should be further repeated since they appear most clearly in their effect. What he's really answering at this first part is people are going, okay, why were there so many miracles in the early church and then not as much now? Okay, he's sort of getting at that. And it's a legitimate question. His answer is, well, you don't need the miracles anymore because the church itself is the miracle. Right? You guys probably heard the story of Napoleon is, he's trying to destroy the church, and he put the Pope in captivity, and he's talking to a cardinal, and he looks at the cardinal and he goes, "Your Eminence, you know I have the power to destroy the church." And the cardinal just kind of laughs at him. He goes, "You have no idea. It's like we've been trying to destroy the church for 1,800 years, and we haven't succeeded. You have no chance." Right? So the human element of the church. I mean that by all sort of accounts, the church shouldn't exist anymore, right? Like if you just look at from a human level, like the church should have passed away a long time ago, right? Like every human institution passes away, and yet 2,000 years later, church is still here, right? So again, this to me is the most like when I ask people this question, is the most compelling, and I don't tell it to them, okay, this is proof. But what it does is they have to answer, like if they're going to be intellectually honest, they have to answer the question, how in the world something that is merely human lasts that long? Yes, Steve, what were you going to ask?
Like, how would you respond to a person that asks, like, sure, it's existed for 2,000 years, but it's changed a lot since then. So since it's changed, it has to be different.
Yeah, I mean, in essence, it hasn't changed maybe as much as they're saying.
Okay.
Right. I guess it would. I probably in that situation I would ask, well, what do you mean by change? Right. Of course, it grew, just like an acorn turns into an oak tree, but all of the elements from the acorn are still there, right? So regardless of whether it changed, even things that adapted. I mean, the Roman Empire over its 800 years, it changed too, right? And it's still not the way of all human institutions, right? So to me, like somebody has to answer that question. Like if they're going to be honest, and this is the people that then the person who's honest is the person who faith paves the way for, right? Because when they're honestly going, yeah, that definitely has credence to the truth of the Catholic Church. That it goes back all the way back to Jesus, who I may or may not know who he is, but that's really weird. It's really weird it grew under those circumstances. Wait, they had no armies. They weren't putting people under the sword when they did this. Nope, they were on the wrong end of the sword, right? So all of those things have to be answered if someone's going to be intellectually honest about it. And that's what when you use these, you're really looking for the intellectually honest person, right? Because you can't give someone else faith, right? All you can do is pave the way. Right? All you can do is get them asking the questions. Right. And then when they have the questions, you got to be there to answer them. But nevertheless, you can't give them faith. And so these motives of credibility go, okay, it's reasonable to believe. Now, sort of hand it over to God, right? And God always will respond, right? I think Aquinas in another place, he gives us sort of dilemma too, where he says, like if you look at church history, and he essentially says, like, either the church is a miracle in and of itself that it still exists, or it's not a miracle, which is still a miracle. So he says this little dilemma. He's like, okay, it's either a miracle or it's not. But if it's not a miracle, how did it last for 2,000 years, right? So in my mind, that seems to be the sort of the most powerful of the four. Yes. Just go ahead.
So I was trying to ask. I mean, Are we trying to combine? Are all these combined together taken as motives of spirituality? Because there might be other religions that might have lasted longer. So it's the combination of all of them.
Yeah. So what I normally do if I talk to people is I lead with this last one, because then the others all sort of pile on top, right? And some of it just depends on where the person is too, right? But it's amazing to me how many people don't, even Catholics, don't know about like the miracle of Fatima. Again, somebody's got to answer to that, right? If you're intellectually honest, every one of the like newspapers at the time covered it. They covered it exactly how it said it happened. Like 70,000 people witnessed it. They could see it from miles away. You've got to be able to answer that question. And what happens is people try to debunk it with science. They're like, oh, well, the atmosphere was this way, blah, 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 blah. Doesn't matter, right? Somehow you still got to get at the fact that these ignorant little children predicted something crazy was going to happen, right? Which in and of itself is a miracle, right? Like, how did they know? All these scientists, they didn't figure out that the atmosphere was going to do that day. So again, if you sort of start peeling stuff away from people, it becomes like the question of like pearls before swine, right? Like this is where it sort of reveals like is someone ready? Like if they're open to finding the truth, then they'll normally take these things in and kind of sit with them. If they're not, if they go immediately into debunk mode, then you're sort of like, okay, I need to get at this person one more time on the knees, right? All right, questions? Are there any questions online? So Alicia, you had a comment you made in the chat, but I have no idea when that actually came up.
That was when you were talking about people being blinded when they walk out into the light. Credo has a very interesting allegory of the cave that kind of talks about that exact concept. Can you hear me?
Well, I can't hear her.
Can you hear me now? No?
All right, for some reason I can't, I can see you're talking, but I can't hear you.
I think it's on his end because we were able to hear you.
All right, while she's typing that out, any other questions? Yes, Steve.
Sorry, I had to take a call when you were like going over the Richard Dawkins point. Like what was the thing in his?
Yeah, so his point was, I should make one of you guys explain it to him, but his point is he's looking at this sort of, he's recoiling at the idea of an infinite regress.
Oh, okay.
And what the sort of the solution is the infinite regress doesn't go back in time. It goes straight up and down right here, right now. Where, there's nothing that actually has it. If you're not the source of your own existence, you depend on something else for existence right now. Right. And so there has to be something that doesn't depend, that's self-existing, and that something is God.
Okay, so what do you mean that he's trying to go backwards?
So what he says is that the way he reads what St. Thomas is saying, this is common, where he says, okay, the earth depends upon the sun for its existence, and the sun depends upon, like, he keeps going, a person would be better. So I depend on my parents, who depend on their parents, who depend on their, like, and he's saying, well, you could have an infinite regress of that, right? Like you could keep going back. And if you go back in time, then the idea of an infinite regress is totally possible, because you can have an eternal universe, right? But what St. Thomas is saying is, no, the argument is not backwards in time. The argument is right up and down existence right now.
Okay. So how is that the up and down different?
So the up and down is if nothing that is observed is the cause of its own existence, like nothing is self-existing, right? Everything in the world you see is not self-existing. So if nothing is self-existing, it has to have its existence right now, has to depend on something that is self-existing.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Which, by the way, is the way God reveals himself to Moses, right? He says, I am who I am. I'm existence itself.
Because if you did it through the infinite regress way, you can point something back from like myself to something that's not self-existing.
Right. Well, because you could say, well, the universe itself
Yeah.
is eternal.
Yeah.
Because there's no way to prove it's not, right? So St. Thomas says there's no way to prove that. We only know that because God has revealed it, because he said in the beginning. Okay. All right, anything else? All right, let me see what the question is. Yeah, so the question was more of a comment. It was talking about when I was talking about the blinding, the idea of Plato's allegory of the cave. Yes, and so the question, I wonder why I can't hear anybody. Kevin's question, is it possible to start from a mystery of faith and reason to another one? Yes. So that was the development of doctrine, right, that we talked about. Right, so if Jesus is truly man, then we can say a lot of things about Mary as his mother, just from the fact that we know that Jesus is truly fully God and fully man. Question 2, what does it mean to say that the faith is super rational? I don't know that I would say, I don't know if I would use that term super rational. I would say it's supernatural in the sense that it's rational. So again, because we can reason two other articles of faith and use reason to see how they're connected. But I think it's supernatural. We would say it's supernatural because of its source.